Yo, what's up guys, it's Atrix here. Today we'll be finally finding out which is the best Nintendo Switch emulator for Android. Yuzu, Ns, Skyline will be going against each other to let us know which emulator is best in terms of performance, optimizations, graphics quality, stability, gameplay experience and much more. So if you guys are new here, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, turn on all notification as I upload similar videos on my channel. With that being said, let's get started through today's video. Here we have all three emulators which will be going against each other. I'll be using the normal version of Yuzu emulator Android, also Skyline's last build which was Skyline Edge version 69 and the Ns Emulator 4.2.0 latest build. First of all, we have the UI of emulators and I have to give it to Ns Emulator because the UI looks the best to me. You can see all the games are arranged properly and whenever you click on a game, it changes the background, so it chooses the game's image and blurs it, adds a pretty great effect. You can also customize themes, so 1 point goes to Ns Emulator. Next up we have official Yuzu emulator Android. Now I personally don't really like the Yuzu emulator's UI because it's a bit congested, and if we just go to the search option and then we can sort it to recently played, recently added, retail, homebrew, etc. So compared to Ns, Yuzu emulator doesn't really have a good home layout. Next up we have Skyline Edge, and I have to say Skyline emulator's UI is one of my favorites as it was the first ever Nintendo Switch emulator for Android, open source that is. You can get a lot of information like the game version, game's title name, and also the images are curved, so materialistic UI has been provided in Skyline emulator, which I personally prefer compared to Yuzu emulator's boxy logos. So definitely Skyline Edge is number 2 in terms of UI. Let's talk about the user friendliness of emulators. Ns Emulator is zero, literally zero in terms of being user friendly because it has a lot of ads. It's very complicated to set up. One of the most annoying things about this emulator is whenever you start it, you are instantly greeted with an ad and you can't really use this emulator offline, and hence I don't really prefer Ns in terms of user friendliness. Let's move on towards Yuzu, and I have to rank it as number 1 in terms of user friendliness because right off the bat when you open it for the first time you get an setup procedure. So using this emulator is pretty easy. There are obviously no ads, no VIP section or any BS like that, so I do prefer Yuzu emulator more than Skyline. Speaking of Skyline, user friendliness has to be top 2 because Skyline emulator doesn't really provide any instruction to set up the emulator when you open it for the first time, but still it's not as bad as Ns emulator. Now let's talk about the settings that are provided in these emulators, starting off with Ns. So if we just go ahead and go here and go to game settings, you will find out it's very hard to click and hence I will deduct a point. Anyways, if we scroll down in the global settings, there are very few options. One of the things I also hate about Ns Emulator is the fact that you have to customize each and every single game settings accordingly. Like there are no global settings which will be applied to all these games, but instead you have to select a game which you want to play, then go to game settings, then you have official settings or custom settings. And here you will have to enable or disable settings like texture compatible mode, etc. But let me show you guys the best setting for Ns Emulator. Emu GPU feature, make sure to turn it off. Let's scroll down, make sure to turn off motion as well, enable speed mode, fast FB readback only if your game doesn't have any issues. If your games have issues, then disable it because it can cause some graphical issues. Multi-thread shaders, make sure to enable this. Video decoding, also make sure to enable this. Disk shader cache, also enable this. Graphics driver, you don't really need to set it up. Audio backend, use AA audio. Fast memory, keep it at page unit or disabled. Now I personally like to go with disabled because most of the times if your game is giving you a black screen, it's because of the page unit settings. So that's why I disable my fast memory and all my games appear to be working perfectly fine. Now let's move on towards the Yuzu emulators settings. So we can just go to settings, then click on advanced settings, and it is a bit more organized than Ns as well as Skyline because you have general settings, system settings, graphics settings, audio and debug. It's a bit more organized and all of these are global settings. But one downside of having global settings is the fact that in Yuzu emulator Android you cannot modify game specific settings yet, but let me show you guys the best settings. Dock mode, make sure to disable this. In general, limit speed percentage, disable this as well. CPU accuracy, keep it at accurate level or at auto. Let's go back to graphics. Here keep the accuracy level normal. Resolution 0.75x. Let's scroll down. Disk shader cache has been disabled. Enable it if you want to play games like Pokemon Sword or Let's Go Pikachu, or disable it if you are playing games which are not really optimized for this emulator. For example, let's say Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. Let's scroll down. Force maximum clocks, make sure to enable this. Adreno GPU specific, use asynchronous shaders, you can also enable this, but it may introduce some glitches. Use reactive flushing, you can enable this, but it doesn't really affect that much, so I always like to keep it disabled. In terms of debug, CPU debugging, make sure to turn it on if you are playing some unoptimized games. One of the bugs about Yuzu Emulator Android is the unfortunate glitch where I can't really change any of the settings, because apparently Yuzu Emulator is thinking that I am inside an game, so I have to close the emulator, restart it, and this time I can change the settings. So this is a bug which I am sure many of you guys might have faced. But one fact that you can't really change game specific settings even after holding them is a bit annoying, because as you know, if you are playing Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu, you have to disable dock mode, whereas every other game works pretty well with dock mode enabled. So you have to change the settings again and again. You can't really set game specific settings. So I'd like to give the Yuzu emulator number 2 spot in terms of settings. And Skyline Emulator, how can we forget this? It has more useful settings than Ns Emulator and Yuzu emulator. In the latest upcoming Strato emulator, you can also add additional search locations, which is not really present on Skyline Edge for now. But in theme section, you can change the theme of the emulator. You can use Material UI 2.0. You can also change game sorting order, game display layout. Like, let me just go ahead and choose grid compact, and I'll show you guys after I show the best settings. Always show game information is pretty good. So if you tap on a game, it will show you game information, then you will get an option to go inside it. But use dock mode has been enabled. Enable internet option has also been provided, but we will be disabling it. Show performance statistics, make sure to enable this option. Aspect ratio, device aspect ratio. Afterwards, you can also disable or enable audio output. GPU driver configuration, as usual, you can add custom GPU drivers. Post triple buffering has been enabled. Disable frame throttling has also been enabled. Executor slot count scale set to max, and executor flush threshold set to 62. Direct memory import has been enabled. Force maximum clocks and free guest texture memory enabled. Fast GPU readback and writes also enabled, and those are the settings of Skyline Emulator. You can also configure input controls. You can change its color, add extra buttons, or even hide some buttons, move them around, so it's pretty good. Recenter sticks on touch, haptic feedback, and much more. So in terms of settings and customizations, I will go with Skyline Emulator as the number 1 spot. And as I was talking, you can also manage the save file of the game from the home screen itself. You can also enable game specific settings by enabling the custom settings option, and hence Skyline Emulator is on the number 1 spot. Now let's directly jump into a game of Pokemon Sword. I'll be going with Pokemon Sword because there are many games which Yuzu can run but Skyline cannot run. Also, yeah, I forgot to talk about the VIP section of Ns Emulator. Okay, I have just gotten the VIP subscription, but anyways, so as I was saying, there are some games which work with Ns Emulator that don't work on Yuzu Android. You already know big titles don't really work on Yuzu as well as Skyline. For example, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom works both on Yuzu and Ns, but it doesn't really work on Skyline. Hence, I am choosing an universal title, which is Pokemon Sword. This is a great benchmark game, but if your Android device is capable of getting this running, it doesn't really mean that it supports all type of Nintendo Switch emulation. It means that most of the mid-range or high-end games can be emulated on your Android device. And if you get at least 30 FPS while emulating Pokemon Sword and Shield, then you are really good to go in terms of Nintendo Switch emulation. But let me just go ahead and tap here, then click on this circle, go to performance settings, make sure to enable unlimited FPS option, enable dock mode. We also get image enhancement, but I won't be using that because my device heats up quite a lot. GPU accuracy is set to normal. You can also enable Adreno boost, but sometimes it will break the game, so I don't really recommend you guys to use that option. But there we go. After unlimiting FPS, you can see we are getting around 50 FPS while emulating Pokemon Sword on our Android devices, and the graphics are looking really sharp. I would say it's Nintendo Switch level after I enable dock mode, and there are no visible graphical issues as you can already tell. Whereas the other emulators which we'll be testing out later on will have visible graphical issues. That's something you need to take note of. You can see the shadow is being shown properly. I would say almost as perfect as Nintendo Switch level, and There are very less frame drops, so I would rate the gameplay experience of Ns Emulator a solid 8 out of 10. But there are indeed emulators which perform way better than Ns in terms of performance. But before I show you guys that, let's move on towards Yuzu Emulator Android. One thing I do hate about the Ns Emulator is the game loading time. It takes about 10 to 20 seconds just to start up Pokemon Sword. Whereas in Yuzu Emulator Android, it should start within 5 to 10 seconds and you can immediately notice the graphical issues. I have just updated this emulator to its latest version and seems like that broke it unfortunately. So let the game start and you can see we are getting 20 FPS, not even 20, 15 to 20 FPS and a lot of graphical issues. Now don't worry, these graphical issues are only device specific problems because my device, which has Adreno 7 series GPU, isn't really well supported for emulation on Yuzu Android. And make sure to enable asynchronous shaders, use reactive flushing. We'll go back to system, we'll disable dock mode and let's try out the game again. There we go, our game has successfully started this time without having any graphical issues, and I also disabled a custom GPU driver as Yuzu Emulator Android doesn't really like to work well with custom GPU drivers on my Android device which has Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor. Now let's take a look at the performance. You can see the shaders are being compiled one by one and it usually takes a lot of time as I have enabled disk shader cache. The graphic quality, you can also see there are a lot of glitches. For example, the shadows, it's not casting the lighting properly, and the performance of Yuzu Android is not really great as well. You can see at the top left side we are getting only about 15 to 20 FPS. That's not considered to be playable because on my Android device, if I'm getting this low of a FPS, that too at 0.75x resolution, like let me zoom in and show you guys that all the textures are jittery. It's not high resolution graphics and still we are facing these many graphical issues along with low FPS problems. I would rank Yuzu Emulator Android in terms of gameplay experience and performance on the number 3 spot of our today's list. So that sums it up for Yuzu Emulator Android. I do prefer Yuzu Android if I am playing games like Demon Slayer, Hinokami Chronicles or Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 as they work well with playable results. But let's try out Skyline Edge version 69. Most of these games which you are seeing don't even boot on Skyline Edge. It can only run OG games like Pokemon Sword, Let's Go Pikachu, Legends Arceus, Scarlet, Zelda Breath of the Wild, but with lot of graphical issues. And one thing that I really prefer about Skyline Emulator is the fact that the game loads super fast, like within 2 seconds the game starts. By the way, make sure to disable the direct memory import option. Enable use direct memory import only if you want to play games like Brilliant Diamond. But there we go, the game has successfully started, and first of all I have to compliment the graphics quality because we are able to play this game at 1x resolution unlike Yuzu Emulator Android, and we are also getting way better FPS than Ns. So at the top left side you can see we are getting around 47 FPS and it might seem equal to Ns Emulator, but it feels way faster. Now Ns Emulator has a tendency of faking the FPS bar as well. As sad as it seems, they want to get lot of clout for their emulator, but Skyline performs truly amazing. And let me talk about the graphical experience while emulating games in Skyline. You can see the shadow is moving around, very amazing to see. It is also Nintendo Switch level of graphic quality, but only in few supported games or a few optimized games. There are many games like Pokemon Scarlet, Brilliant Diamond, Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, etc. When you try to emulate it on Skyline, you will face some graphical issues, that's to be noted, and there will be some stuttering issues. As you can see, the game suddenly is running super slow, whereas the FPS bar is still showing 58 FPS. It might crash or it might freeze, but those things happen very rarely. So let me tell you guys the verdict of today's video. The answer which you all have been waiting for, which is the best emulator, is that Skyline, Ns or Yuzu Android. And the truth is, if you want to play a lot of games, Nintendo Switch games on Android with decent FPS, I'll have to rank Ns as number 1. But if you want more FPS, better FPS than Ns and open source code, if you are more ethical, then I'll rank Skyline Edge as number 1 spot in terms of Nintendo Switch emulation on Android. So I would say Ns and Skyline are tied together, whereas Yuzu Android has a long way to go it has to improve its performance optimizations, so it's not really on equal footing with Ns or Skyline. But in terms of games compatibility, Yuzu and Ns are the best option. So that's going to be it for today's video. Let me know in the comment section down below which Nintendo Switch emulator do you guys use. With that being said, see you guys next time. Goodbye.